A young black woman feeds a homeless man who walks into the restaurant she works at. Later, she is shocked to discover the true identity of the homeless man when she sees his face on a missing person poster. The evening rush had just begun at the small, worn-down diner where Sarah worked. The clinking of dishes, the hum of conversations, and the sizzle of the grill filled the air. Sarah moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and coffee pots, her mind racing as fast as her feet. The bills were piling up at home, and her mother's condition was getting worse. She needed to find the money for the surgery soon, or it would be too late. Her back ached, and she felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones. But there was no time to slow down. Her mother needed her, and every dollar counted. The bell above the door jingled, and Sarah glanced up to see an elderly man shuffling inside. His clothes were tattered, hanging loosely on his frail frame. He stood in the doorway, looking around with a lost expression. He muttered something under his breath, his voice too soft for Sarah to catch. Sarah frowned, her heart tightening. She couldn't remember seeing him before. He looked confused, like he didn't know where he was. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached him. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked gently. "Do you need help?" The man turned his watery blue eyes to her, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the counter. "Hungry. Help." His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Sarah's chest tightened. "Of course. Let's get you seated." She guided him to a booth in the corner, far away from the bustle of the diner. "Sit tight. I'll bring you something to eat." The man nodded, his expression one of quiet relief as he sank into the seat. Sarah returned to the counter and quickly assembled a plate of hot soup and a sandwich. She carried it over, setting it down in front of him. "Here you go. It's on me," she said softly. "Eat as much as you want." The man looked at the food as if he hadn't seen a proper meal in days. He reached out, his hands shaking, and picked up the spoon. He took a small sip of the soup, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the warmth. "Thank you," he murmured. I didn't know where else to go." Sarah sat down across from him, taking a moment to rest. "No need to thank me. Just eat." "You look like you need it." He ate slowly, with a dignity that touched Sarah's heart. Despite his obvious hunger, he didn't rush, didn't gulp the food down as she had expected. It was as if he were trying to hold on to every bite, every taste. "Do you have a name?" she asked gently. He paused, his brow furrowing as if the question was too difficult. "Thomas, I think." "Thomas Green," Sarah nodded. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Green." "I'm Sarah." He smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Sarah. You're very kind, Sarah." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled back. She glanced at the clock. Her shift was almost over, and she needed to get home. But she couldn't just leave him here. He seemed so lost, so fragile. "Do you have a place to go?" she asked carefully. "A family, maybe?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I don't remember. I don't know where I am." Her heart ached at the uncertainty in his voice. She looked around the diner, then back at him. She couldn't just walk away. "Okay, how about this? We'll figure it out together. My shift's almost over. Let me get you some more food and we'll talk." He nodded again, his expression a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Yes, that would be good." Sarah stood, heading back to the counter to grab him another sandwich. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man's story, something she needed to understand. She glanced over at him, watching as he sipped his soup with trembling hands. "Whatever you've been through, we'll get you some help," she murmured to herself. She filled a cup with warm tea and brought it over to him. "Here you go," she said, setting the cup down gently. "Drink this. It'll help you feel better." Thomas looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're too kind, young lady. Too kind." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it down, forcing a smile. Just doing what anyone would, but she knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't even look twice at a man like Thomas, lost and disoriented. She glanced around the diner, noticing how the other patrons avoided looking in their direction, lost in their own worlds. "Just eat, okay?" she said softly. "You're safe here." As he ate, Sarah went back to work, clearing tables and taking care of the last few customers of the night. But her mind kept drifting back to Thomas, sitting alone in the corner booth, his frail shoulders hunched over his meal. When her shift finally ended, she walked back over to him. "My shift's done. Are you ready to go?" He looked up at her, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Go? Where?" Sarah bit her lip. "Well, I thought I'd walk with you, see if we can find out more about where you're from. Is that okay?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you." They left the diner together, stepping out into the cool night air. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for this man. She didn't know his story, didn't know where he belonged, but she knew she couldn't leave him alone, not tonight. A few blocks away, they passed a bulletin board covered with flyers and notices. One of them caught Sarah's eye, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, staring back at her from a missing persons poster, was Thomas's face. "Thomas, that's you," she whispered, pointing at the poster. "You've been missing for over a month." Thomas stared at the poster, his face blank. I don't remember." Sarah took a deep breath, pulling out her phone. "I'm going to call this number, okay? We'll get you home." She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was going to help this man, no matter what it took. The street was quiet as Sarah and Thomas stood in front of the bulletin board. The dim glow of a nearby street lamp cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the missing persons poster. "Thomas Green, 78, missing since June 12th, it read, alongside a blurry photograph of the man beside her. His face looked slightly younger and healthier in the picture, but there was no mistaking the gentle eyes and thinning white hair. "Thomas, this is you," she said softly, pointing to the poster. "You've been missing for over a month." Thomas squinted at the poster, then back at Sarah, his face a mask of confusion. I don't remember. Where am I?" "You're in the city near the diner where I work," she explained patiently. "Do you remember coming in earlier?" He shook his head slowly, his hands trembling as he reached up to touch the poster. "No, everything's blurry. I don't know how I got here." Sarah's heart ached at the lost look in his eyes. She glanced at the phone number listed on the flyer. Whoever had been looking for Thomas must be worried sick. She knew she had to call, but she hesitated, unsure of how this would all play out. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'm going to call this number, and we'll figure out where you belong, all right?" Thomas nodded, still looking at the poster as if it held the answers to questions he couldn't even remember. Sarah dialed the number with shaky fingers, holding the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a man's voice answered. "Hello?" The voice was tense, anxious. "Hi, my name is Sarah," she began, glancing at Thomas, who was now staring at his own shoes. "I think I've found someone who's been missing." "Thomas Green?" There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then the man spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Thomas? My father? Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," Sarah said gently. "He's here with me now. He seems confused, but he's safe. I found him at the diner where I work." "Oh my God." The man's voice broke, and Sarah could hear him struggling to hold back tears. Thank you so much. Where are you?" "I'll come right away." She quickly gave him the address, assuring him that they would wait there until he arrived. After she hung up, she turned back to Thomas, who was watching her with a wary expression. "Your son is coming to get you," she said softly. "He's on his way right now." "Son?" Thomas echoed, frowning. "I have a son?" "Yes, his name is David. He's been looking for you." Thomas looked down at his hands, confusion etched into every line of his face. "David, I don't remember. I'm sorry." "It's okay," Sarah assured him. "You don't have to remember right now. The important thing is you're safe." They stood there in silence for a few minutes, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket. Sarah glanced at her phone again. It hadn't been long, but the minutes felt like hours. She was nervous, unsure of what to say or do. She just knew she couldn't leave Thomas alone. Finally, the quiet was broken by the sound of a car approaching. A sleek, black luxury car pulled up to the curb, and a tall man in his early 40s stepped out. He looked around frantically until his eyes landed on Thomas and Sarah. "Dad!" he called, his voice breaking. Thomas looked up, his expression blank at first. Then, as David approached, something seemed to click in his eyes. "David," he whispered, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Yes, Dad, it's me." David's voice shook as he reached out and gently took his father's hands. "It's me, David. I've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah stepped back, giving them space. David was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he hugged his father tightly. Thomas stood stiffly, still looking bewildered, but there was a hint of recognition in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Dad," David murmured. "I didn't know where you were. I was so scared." Thomas patted his son's back awkwardly. "I'm sorry too. I don't know how I got lost." David pulled back slightly, his eyes red but his face filled with relief. He turned to Sarah, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much for finding him and taking care of him." "I don't know how to repay you." Sarah shook her head, feeling a bit overwhelmed by his intensity. "It's okay, really. I just did what anyone would." "No," David insisted, his gaze earnest. "You did more than most people would. You found him, called me. I thought I'd lost him forever." Sarah glanced at Thomas, who was watching her with a puzzled but gentle smile. "I'm just glad he's okay." David turned back to his father, his hand still gripping Thomas's shoulder as if afraid to let go. "Let's get you home, Dad." Thomas nodded slowly. "Home? Yes, I'd like that." David glanced back at Sarah. "Please, let me do something for you." Anything. I can't just leave without thanking you properly. Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to say. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone who looked like he could afford to give away the world. Really, it's fine. I'm just glad I could help. David's expression softened. Please, at least let me drive you home. It's the least I can do. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, if you're sure. David opened the car door for his father, helping him into the passenger seat. He turned back to Sarah, a smile tugging at his lips despite the tears that still glistened in his eyes. Thank you, Sarah. I'll never forget this. She nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. You're welcome. They drove in silence, the city lights flashing by as Sarah directed him to her apartment. She couldn't help but steal glances at David, noticing the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He seemed like someone who was used to being in control, and she could see how much this had shaken him. When they arrived, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt, turning to David with a small smile. Thank you for the ride. David shook his head. I should be thanking you. He paused, his eyes searching hers. Sarah, if there's ever anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. You've done more for my family tonight than I can ever repay. She hesitated, her thoughts drifting to her mother, the medical bills, the constant worry that hung over her like a cloud. But she pushed those thoughts away, not wanting to burden a stranger with her problems. Just take care of your dad, she said softly. That's thanks enough. David nodded, his expression serious. I will. And, I mean it, Sarah. If you ever need anything, call me. He handed her a business card. Sarah took it, glancing at the neat lettering that spelled out his name and contact information. David Green, Green Construction. I'll keep that in mind, she said, tucking the card into her pocket. As she stepped out of the car, she watched as David drove away, his taillights disappearing into the night. She stood there for a moment, the events of the evening swirling around in her mind. She had no idea how much this encounter would change her life, how this single act of kindness would ripple outward, touching so many lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, as she made her way up the stairs to her apartment, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. Sarah woke up the next morning feeling a sense of disbelief, as if the events of the previous night had been a dream. She still had David's business card on her bedside table, the neatly printed name and number, a tangible reminder that it had all really happened. As she got ready for her shift at the diner, she couldn't help but think about Thomas and his son. David's relief and gratitude were still vivid in her mind, and she wondered how they were doing now that they were reunited. By the time Sarah's shift ended that evening, she was exhausted but relieved. It had been a busy day, and her mind kept drifting back to the events of the night before. Just as she was about to leave, the bell above the door chimed, and she turned to see David walking in. He looked different in the bright lights of the diner, more relaxed but still carrying the weight of worry in his eyes. He spotted her immediately and approached with a grateful smile. Sarah, he greeted warmly. I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a minute? She nodded, glancing at her watch. Sure, I'm just finishing up. How's your father? David's face softened. He's doing better thanks to you. It's still a bit of a struggle, but he's home and safe. That's more than I could have hoped for. Sarah felt a warm flush of relief. I'm glad. He seemed so lost last night. David nodded, his eyes shadowed with concern. It's been hard. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's a few years ago, but this was the first time he wandered off. I can't even describe how terrifying it was not knowing where he was. I can't imagine, Sarah said quietly. It's good you found him when you did. David hesitated, then took a deep breath. I want to do something for you, Sarah. You didn't just help my dad. You helped me too. I can't just let it go. Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse, to say it was nothing. But she remembered the look in David's eyes the night before, the raw emotion that had been so genuine. She knew he needed to feel like he could do something to show his gratitude, even if she didn't feel like she deserved it. I appreciate that, really, she said, choosing her words carefully. But I was just doing what anyone would. David shook his head. No, Sarah, not everyone would have gone out of their way like you did. You didn't just call the number. You stayed with him, made sure he was okay. That means a lot to me. Sarah looked down, feeling a bit embarrassed by his praise. I'm just glad he's safe. There was a pause, and then David glanced around the nearly empty diner. Do you have a few minutes? Maybe we could sit and talk? Sarah hesitated. She still had to get home, but something in David's expression made her want to listen. Okay, sure. They sat down at a small table by the window. David folded his hands on the table, looking down at them as if gathering his thoughts. I know we just met, but I feel like I owe you so much already, he began. Last night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you did, and I realized that I know almost nothing about you. Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his openness. There's not much to know, really. I work here, and I take care of my mom. That's about it. Your mom? David's brow furrowed. Is she okay? Sarah hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling the truth. She's not well. She's been sick for a while and she needs surgery. It's been tough trying to make ends meet. David's face tightened with concern. I'm so sorry to hear that. What kind of surgery does she need? Heart surgery, Sarah said quietly. It's expensive, and I'm still trying to figure out how to pay for it. There was a moment of silence, and then David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Sarah, what if I helped? I could cover the cost of the surgery. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. No, I can't let you do that, she said quickly. It's too much. I don't even know you, but you didn't know me or my dad either, David countered gently. And yet, you helped him. You saved him. This is the least I can do. Sarah shook her head, her thoughts spinning. It was too much, too fast. She didn't want to be a charity case, didn't want to feel like she owed someone something. I appreciate the offer, really, she said, her voice strained, but I can't accept that. I have to figure this out on my own. David looked like he wanted to argue, but he stopped himself. He took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. Okay, I understand. But if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. Sarah managed a small smile, touched by his sincerity. Thank you. That means a lot. They sat in silence for a moment. The noise of the diner, a soft background hum. Sarah could feel the weight of David's gaze on her, and she wondered what he was thinking. She was used to people brushing her off, not really caring about her problems. It was strange to have someone, especially a stranger, care so much. David cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Would you mind if I drove you home? It's the least I can do. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, thank you. They left the diner together, stepping into the cool evening air. David led her to his car, a sleek black sedan that looked out of place in her neighborhood. He opened the door for her, and she slid in, feeling a bit out of her element. As they drove through the city, David glanced over at her. I can't imagine how you manage everything. Working 2 jobs, taking care of your mom. You're stronger than most people I know. Sarah shrugged, looking out the window. You do what you have to for family. David was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke softly. You remind me of my dad, before he got sick. He was always taking care of everyone, always putting others first. It's not easy, but it's admirable. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat but forced it down. She didn't feel admirable. She felt tired, overwhelmed, and scared, but she didn't know how to say that to a man she barely knew. Your dad seems like a good man, she said instead. I'm glad he's back with you. David nodded. He is, and I'm grateful every day that he's still here, even if he doesn't always remember me. They pulled up in front of her apartment building, and David put the car in park. He turned to her, his eyes serious. Sarah, I meant what I said. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me. Sarah looked down at the business card he had given her the night before, still in her hand. She knew she probably wouldn't call. Her pride wouldn't let her, but it was nice to know that someone cared. I will, she said quietly. Thank you, David, for everything. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Thank you, Sarah, for finding my dad and bringing him back to me. She nodded, then opened the door and stepped out. She watched as he drove away, feeling a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, hope, and something she couldn't quite name. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she thought about the offer David had made. It was generous, almost unbelievably so, but she knew she couldn't accept it. Not yet. This was her problem to solve, her burden to bear. But still, as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she felt another small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change for the better. Sarah's mother, Lydia, was sitting up in bed when Sarah got home. The apartment was small and tidy, though the air felt heavy with the scent of medication and the quiet hum of the oxygen machine. Lydia's face lit up when she saw Sarah. Her smile warmed despite the deep lines of pain and fatigue etched into her features. You're home early, Lydia said, her voice a little weak but filled with affection. Sarah set down her bag and pulled up a chair beside her mother's bed. Yeah, someone offered me a ride home. Saved me a bus fare. She smiled, but her thoughts were still spinning from her conversation with David. Lydia looked at her daughter closely, her sharp eyes noticing the tension in Sarah's posture. Everything okay? Yeah, it's just been a long day. Sarah took a deep breath, then decided to tell her mother what had happened. Actually, something did happen. Last night at the diner, I found this elderly man. He was lost, didn't know where he was. I gave him some food, and then I realized he was on a missing person poster. His son came to get him. Lydia's eyes widened. Oh my, that's incredible, Sarah. You found him? Is he okay now? Sarah nodded. Yeah, his son David was really grateful. He even came back today to thank me again. Her mother reached out. placing a frail hand over Sarah's. "I'm proud of you, sweetie. Not many people would go out of their way like that." Sarah shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "It was nothing, really. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Lydia said softly, her eyes full of pride. "You have a good heart, Sarah." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then, Sarah took a deep breath. "Actually, there's more. David offered to help with the cost of your surgery." Lydia's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to respond. But Sarah hurried on. "I told him no, of course. I mean, I don't even know him. It's too much to accept from someone I just met." Lydia's hand tightened around Sarah's. "Honey, why did you say no?" Sarah blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean? I can't just let a stranger pay for something like that." Lydia sighed softly, her eyes sad but understanding. "Sarah, I know you're trying to protect me, but this is your chance. You've been working yourself to the bone, trying to make this happen. If someone's willing to help, you should at least consider it." "But Mom, it doesn't feel right," Sarah protested, her voice strained. "I don't want to be some charity case. I want to take care of this myself." Lydia's eyes softened. "I know, sweetie, but sometimes taking care of yourself means accepting help. You've done everything you can for me. It's okay to let someone else carry some of the weight." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. She knew her mother was right. The stress of working 2 jobs, the constant worry about bills, and the fear of losing her mother were all taking a toll on her. But the idea of accepting such a huge favor from David felt overwhelming. "I don't know, Mom," she whispered. "It just feels complicated." Lydia smiled gently. "Life is complicated, honey, but you have to think about what's best for you too. And for me, I want to see you happy, not running yourself ragged trying to be everything to everyone." Sarah nodded slowly, the words sinking in. She knew how much her mother worried about her, even from her bed. The thought of easing that burden, even just a little, was tempting. They were interrupted by the buzzing of Sarah's phone. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip a beat. It was David. "Speaking of complicated," she murmured, showing the phone to her mother. "Answer it," Lydia urged gently. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up the call. "Hello? Hi, Sarah, it's David. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." His voice was calm and warm. "No, it's fine. What's up?" Sarah tried to sound casual, but her heart was racing. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about earlier," David said, his tone sincere. "I understand your hesitation, but I really want to help. Please, let me do this for you and your mother." Sarah glanced at Lydia, who was watching her with hopeful eyes. "I don't know, David. It's a very generous offer, but it's a lot." "I know it is," David said gently, "and I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But I can afford to do this and I want to. You've already done so much for my family. This is the least I can do in return." Sarah bit her lip, feeling torn. She didn't want to be someone who took advantage, but she also didn't want to keep struggling alone when help was right there. David continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "Think of it as a thank you for saving my father. You gave him back to me. That's something I can never repay, but I want to try." Sarah glanced at her mother again. Lydia nodded encouragingly. "Okay," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're sure, then yes, I'll accept your help." There was a pause, and then David's voice came through, filled with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. You don't know how happy that makes me. I'll make all the arrangements for the surgery. You just focus on taking care of your mom." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you, David. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," David replied softly. "Just let me know if there's anything else you need, okay?" "I will," Sarah promised, feeling a strange mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her. "Thank you, really." They ended the call and Sarah looked at her mother, who was smiling through her own tears. "See?" Lydia said softly. "Sometimes it's okay to let people help." Sarah nodded, still feeling a little dazed. "I just hope I'm doing the right thing." "You are," Lydia assured her. "And now we can focus on getting me better." Sarah leaned over and hugged her mother gently, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe things would finally start to turn around. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she thought about David and everything that had happened over the past few days. It all felt surreal, like a whirlwind that had swept her up and changed everything in an instant. She knew there would be challenges ahead, that accepting help didn't mean all her problems would magically disappear. But for now, she felt a sense of peace, knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to get better. Sarah woke up the next morning with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. She sat up slowly, glancing at her mother still asleep in the next room, the soft rise and fall of her chest a comforting sight. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could finally breathe. After a quick breakfast, She sat down at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to sort through the thoughts racing in her mind. Accepting David's offer had been a huge decision, and it still felt surreal. But now, there was a chance her mother could get the surgery she needed. There was a chance for a future that wasn't overshadowed by constant fear and worry. Lydia's soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Morning, sweetie." Sarah turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, leaning slightly on her walker. "Morning, Mom. How are you feeling?" "Better today," Lydia replied, making her way to the table and sitting down carefully. "It's amazing what a little hope can do." Sarah smiled, pouring her mother a cup of tea. "Yeah, it is." They sipped their drinks in comfortable silence, the morning sun filtering through the small kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal, like they were just two people enjoying a quiet morning together. But the weight of reality was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "David called last night," Sarah said after a while, her voice tentative. "He said he's already started making arrangements for your surgery." Lydia looked at her daughter with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "He's not wasting any time, is he?" "No, he's not," Sarah agreed, smiling a little. "He's really serious about helping us." Lydia reached out and placed a gentle hand over Sarah's. "And how do you feel about it?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts into words. I don't know. Part of me feels guilty, like I'm taking advantage of his kindness. But then I think about you, and I know this is the best thing for you. I just want you to get better." Lydia's eyes softened. "Sarah, you're not taking advantage of anyone. David offered because he wants to help. You've done so much for me, sacrificed so much. It's okay to let someone else step in for a change." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know. It's just hard to let go, I guess." "I understand," Lydia said quietly. "But you've been carrying this burden alone for too long. It's time to let someone else share the load." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah knew her mother was right, but it was still difficult to accept. She had spent so long fighting alone, being strong for both of them, that letting someone else help felt almost unnatural. The sound of her phone buzzing broke the silence. She glanced at the screen and saw David's name flashing. "It's him," she said softly, a mix of nerves and anticipation tightening in her chest. "Answer it," Lydia urged, smiling gently. "You'll feel better once you talk to him." Sarah nodded and picked up the phone, her heart pounding as she pressed the call button. "Hello? Hi, Sarah, it's David. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," Sarah replied, glancing at her mother, who was watching her with an encouraging smile. "What's up?" "I just wanted to let you know that everything's set for your mom's surgery. I've spoken to the hospital, and they're ready to schedule it as soon as possible." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was really happening. "Wow, that's amazing, David. Thank you so much." "You don't have to thank me," David said softly. "I'm just glad I can help. They'll be in touch soon to finalize the details, but it looks like they could do the surgery as early as next week." "Next week?" Sarah repeated, her voice barely a whisper. She glanced at Lydia, who looked equally shocked. "Yes, they're going to prioritize her case," David explained. "I know it's sudden, but I thought you'd want to get it done as soon as possible." "Absolutely," Sarah said quickly. "I can't believe this is really happening." "It is," David said gently. "I know it's a lot to take in, but everything's going to be okay." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes and she blinked them back. "Thank you, David. You have no idea what this means to us." "I think I have some idea," David replied, his voice warm. "I'll be there to support you both, whatever you need." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing some of the logistical details, and then Sarah hung up, feeling a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. "He said they could do the surgery next week," she told her mother, her voice trembling slightly. Lydia's eyes widened. "That soon?" "Yeah, I still can't believe it." Lydia reached out and took her daughter's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's really happening, Sarah. This is our chance." Sarah nodded, feeling a rush of emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, hope, fear, all tangled together in a confusing mix. "I know, it's just a lot to process." "I know, sweetheart," Lydia said gently, "but we're going to get through this. Together." The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah barely had time to catch her breath between phone calls with doctors and hospital staff, filling out paperwork, and making sure everything was ready for the surgery. David called regularly, checking in on them and offering support. He even visited once, bringing a bouquet of flowers for Lydia and a small potted plant for Sarah's apartment. "You didn't have to do this," Sarah said, holding the plant carefully as David smiled at her. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "I know it's not much, but I thought it might brighten up your place a bit." "It's perfect," Sarah said, touched by the gesture. "Thank you." David stayed for a while, chatting with Lydia and getting to know her better. It was clear to Sarah that he was genuinely interested in her mother's well-being, and that made her feel a little more at ease with accepting his help. The night before the surgery, Sarah sat by her mother's bed, holding her hand as they talked quietly. Lydia was calm, almost serene, and it was that calmness that finally soothed the last of Sarah's fears. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lydia smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand gently. "A little, but mostly, I'm hopeful." "I know it's going to be okay," Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm going to be there the whole time, I promise." "I know you will be," Lydia said softly, "and that makes all the difference." The next morning, they arrived at the hospital early. The staff was kind and professional, guiding them through the final preparations. David was there too, offering quiet support. He stood with Sarah as they wheeled Lydia away to surgery, his presence a steady, calming influence. "You're doing great," he murmured, his hand a comforting weight on her shoulder. "She's going to be fine," Sarah nodded, clutching her mother's bag tightly in her hands. "I just want this to be over." "It will be soon," David promised. "And then you'll have your mom back, healthy and whole." They sat in the waiting room together, the hours stretching on in agonizing silence. Sarah couldn't stop her mind from racing, imagining every possible outcome, every fear and hope colliding in her head. But then finally a doctor came out, smiling as she approached them. "The surgery went very well," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Your mother is in recovery now. It'll be a little while before she's awake, but everything went smoothly." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you so much." The doctor nodded, smiling gently. "She's a strong woman. She'll need some time to recover, but she's going to be just fine." Sarah turned to David, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you for this." David smiled, his eyes soft. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. I'm just glad I could help." They sat together, waiting for Lydia to wake up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The days after Lydia's surgery passed in a haze of relief and cautious optimism. The operation had been a success, and though Lydia was still weak and recovering, the worst was behind them. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. Sarah spent most of her time at the hospital, sitting by her mother's bed as Lydia slowly regained her strength. Each day brought small improvements, longer conversations, a bit more color in her cheeks, a brighter smile. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted off both of them. And though there was still a long road ahead, they were moving forward. David visited often, bringing flowers, books, and small treats. He always came in quietly, never wanting to intrude, but his presence was a constant comfort to both Sarah and Lydia. He and Lydia would talk softly about everything from family memories to favorite books, and Sarah found herself watching their interactions with a sense of gratitude and something she couldn't quite define. One afternoon, as Sarah and David sat in the hospital cafeteria, taking a break while Lydia rested, David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he began, stirring his coffee absently, "I've been thinking a lot about how things have changed since we met." Sarah looked up from her tea, curious. "Yeah?" David nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. My father, he's not the same as he was. But having him home, knowing he's safe, it's more than I ever hoped for." Sarah felt a warm flush spread through her chest. "I'm just glad I could help. He's a good man." "He is," David agreed. He paused, then looked at her more intently. "But I feel like I've gained more than just having him back. Meeting you and seeing what you've done for your mom, it's made me think about what really matters." Sarah shifted in her seat, a little uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just trying to do what I can. It's been hard, but I've never felt like I had a choice." "That's what's so amazing about you, though," David said quietly. "Most people, when things get tough, they look for an easy way out. But you fight. You take care of everyone around you, even when you're struggling yourself." Sarah looked down at her tea, feeling a mix of emotions. Pride, gratitude, and a hint of embarrassment. "I guess I'm just stubborn," David laughed softly. "Maybe, but it's a good kind of stubborn." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. And then David cleared his throat, his tone more serious. "I've been wanting to ask you something." Sarah glanced up, a little surprised by the change in his voice. "What is it?" "I know you've got a lot on your plate," David began slowly, "but I was wondering if you'd be interested in working for my company. I could really use someone like you, someone dedicated, hardworking, and good with people." Sarah blinked, caught completely off guard. "You want me to work for you?" David nodded. "I know it's a lot to think about, and I don't want you to feel pressured, but I see how capable you are, and I think you'd be a great fit. It's a stable job, with benefits, and you wouldn't have to juggle multiple shifts like you do now." Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. It was an incredible opportunity, one she hadn't even considered. She thought about her current situation, the endless hours at the diner, The constant stress of making ends meet. This job could change everything. I don't know what to say, she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. It's such a generous offer, but I don't have any experience with construction or business. David smiled, his eyes warm. You're smart, and you're a quick learner. We can start you in an administrative role, and if you like it, you can move up from there. There's no rush. Sarah hesitated, feeling overwhelmed by the possibilities. I'll have to think about it. Of course, David said gently. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that the offer's there whenever you're ready. They finished their drinks, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what David had said. A real job, with stability and a future. That was something she hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. Later that evening, as she sat beside her mother's bed, Sarah found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. Lydia was asleep, her breathing steady and even, and the quiet of the hospital room felt almost peaceful. Sarah glanced down at her mother's hand, still clutching hers even in sleep, and felt a surge of love and protectiveness. Everything she had done, every sacrifice, had been for her. And now, with the surgery behind them, there was a chance for something more. A chance for both of them to have a better life. Mom, she whispered softly, though she knew Lydia couldn't hear her. What should I do? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. But as she sat there, watching her mother sleep, Sarah felt a sense of clarity begin to form. She had spent so long fighting to survive, to keep her head above water, that she had forgotten what it felt like to think about the future in a positive way. Maybe it was time to change that. The next day, David arrived at the hospital with a bouquet of sunflowers, Lydia's favorite. He grinned as he handed them to her, his eyes twinkling with a warmth that made Sarah's heart lift. These are beautiful, David, Lydia said, her smile radiant. You're spoiling me. You deserve it, David replied easily. You're looking stronger every day. Thanks to both of you, Lydia said, glancing between Sarah and David. I don't know what I would have done without you two. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat, and she blinked back sudden tears. We're just glad you're okay, Mom. Lydia reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. You've given me a second chance, Sarah. Now it's time to take care of yourself, too. Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting David's over her mother's bed. There was something in his gaze, an unspoken understanding, a quiet encouragement that gave her strength. I've been thinking about what you said, she told him, her voice steady. About the job. David's face lit up with a smile. Yeah, Sarah said, smiling back. I'd like to try it. If the offer's still open, it's always open, David said, his smile widening. I'm so glad, Sarah. I know you'll do great. Lydia's eyes sparkled with pride. This is wonderful news. I'm so proud of you, honey. Sarah laughed softly, feeling a strange sense of lightness in her chest. I haven't even started yet, Mom. But you're taking a step forward, Lydia said gently. That's what matters. The days that followed were a whirlwind of changes. Sarah started training at David's company, working part-time so she could still be with her mother as she recovered. The work was new and challenging, but Sarah found herself enjoying it more than she had expected. She liked the structure, the feeling of accomplishment, and the sense of purpose it gave her. David was patient and supportive, always there to answer her questions and offer guidance. They grew closer, their conversations shifting from work to personal stories, laughter, and quiet moments of shared understanding. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, David drove Sarah home. They talked easily, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had since the beginning. As they pulled up to her apartment, David turned to her, his expression serious. Sarah, I know things have changed a lot for you lately, he began slowly, and I don't want to push you or make you feel uncomfortable. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. Sarah looked at him, her heart full of gratitude, and something deeper, something she was still too afraid to name. Thank you, David. I don't know how I would have gotten through all of this without you. David reached out, his hand resting gently over hers. You've done so much on your own, Sarah. I'm just glad I could be here to help. They sat there for a moment, the silence filled with unspoken words and emotions. Then Sarah nodded, her voice soft but steady. I'm glad you're here too. As she got out of the car and watched him drive away, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future was still uncertain, still full of challenges and unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. With her mother's health improving, a new job that she enjoyed, and a friend like David by her side, Sarah knew she was no longer just surviving, she was living. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. Sarah pulled up in front of the Green family home, a modest, two-story house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It had been a few weeks since Lydia's surgery, and her mother's recovery was going well. With a bit of stability finally in place, Sarah felt like it was time to visit Thomas. He had been on her mind often, his kind smile, the way he had thanked her over and over for that simple meal at the diner. She walked up the path to the front door, carrying a small basket of homemade cookies she had baked that morning. She hoped they might spark a little joy for Thomas, even if he didn't fully remember her. Sarah pressed the doorbell and waited, her nerves fluttering. Moments later, the door swung open, and David's familiar welcoming smile greeted her. "Sarah, it's good to see you," he said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. Come in. Thanks," she replied, stepping inside and glancing around. The house was cozy, filled with the subtle scent of lavender and a sense of calm that put her at ease. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," David assured her. "Dad's in the living room. He'll be happy to see you." They made their way through the hallway, and Sarah felt her heart quicken as they entered the living room. Thomas was sitting in a large armchair by the window, a book in his lap. He looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from confusion to a gentle smile as he recognized David. "Hi, Dad," David said softly, sitting down next to him. "I have someone here to see you." Thomas turned his gaze to Sarah, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place her. "Hello," he said hesitantly. "Do I know you?" Sarah smiled warmly, trying to keep her voice light and gentle. "We met a few weeks ago, Mr. Green, at the diner." "I'm Sarah." A flicker of recognition crossed his face. And then he smiled, the same warm, grateful smile she remembered. "Sarah, yes, I think I remember. You were very kind to me. You brought me food." "Yes, that's right," she said, feeling a surge of relief. "I brought you some cookies today if you'd like." Thomas's smile widened, and he reached out with a slightly unsteady hand. "Thank you, dear. That's very sweet of you." Sarah handed him the basket, her heart swelling with affection, as he carefully took a cookie and bit into it. He chewed slowly, his expression thoughtful. "These are lovely," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you." Sarah sat down in the chair opposite him, glancing at David, who was watching his father with a mixture of love and sadness. "How have you been, Mr. Green?" she asked gently. "Are you feeling better?" Thomas looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. I'm not sure. Sometimes things are clear and other times, it's like everything is foggy." He paused, his gaze drifting out the window. "But I remember you. You were kind to me when I was lost." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm glad I could help." David reached over and squeezed his father's hand gently. "You've been doing really well, Dad. We're just happy to have you home." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes returning to David. "I'm glad to be home too, son." They sat together in the living room, talking quietly. Thomas's mind wandered in and out of the conversation, but every now and then he would look at Sarah and smile, as if he remembered deep down the small act of kindness that had connected them. David excused himself after a while, leaving Sarah and Thomas alone. She watched as Thomas picked up the book in his lap, turning it over in his hands. "I used to love reading," he said softly, almost to himself. "I was a teacher, you know, English. I taught for 30 years. "That's wonderful," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly. "You must have been a great teacher." "I hope so," he murmured, his gaze distant. "It's strange. I can remember my students, their faces, their laughter, but sometimes I forget where I am, what day it is." He looked at her, his eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "Do you know what that's like? To lose yourself?" Sarah felt her chest tighten. "I don't, Mr. Green, but I think you're very brave." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "Brave, maybe, or just lost." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled, reaching out to place her hand over his. "You're not lost anymore. You're home, with your family, and that's what matters." Thomas looked at their hands, his eyes misty. "Home, yes, that's true, and I'm grateful. More than I can say." They sat together for a while longer, talking about little things, the weather, the flowers blooming outside, the way the light fell across the room in the late afternoon. It was peaceful, a quiet connection that didn't need many words. When it was time for her to leave, Sarah stood and smiled at Thomas. "I'll come visit again, if that's okay with you." Thomas's smile was soft, his eyes gentle. "I'd like that, dear. I'd like that very much." David walked her to the door, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for coming, Sarah. It means a lot to him, and to me." Sarah nodded, her heart full. "He's a wonderful man, David. I'm glad I got to know him." David's smile was warm and genuine. "You've been a real light for him, for both of us." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken bond between them deepening. Then David cleared his throat, his tone more serious. "I know this hasn't been easy for you either," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that you've made a real difference in our lives. And I'm not just talking about my dad." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "I'm just happy to help." David's eyes met hers, his gaze steady and sincere. "You're more than just a helper, Sarah. You're part of our family now." The words filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, David. That means a lot. He nodded, his smile softening. Take care, Sarah. And remember, if you ever need anything, I'm always here. I know, she said, feeling a surge of gratitude. And I appreciate it. As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. It had been a long, hard journey, but she knew now that she wasn't alone. She had her mother, who was getting stronger every day. She had David and Thomas, who had become more than just acquaintances. They were friends, family, in a way she hadn't expected. She climbed into her car and started the engine, glancing back at the house one last time. Through the window, she could see Thomas still sitting in his armchair, the book resting in his lap. He looked peaceful, content, and for that, Sarah was grateful. As she drove away, the sun dipping low on the horizon, she felt a quiet, steady hope in her heart. The future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and unknowns, but she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength, surrounded by the people who cared for her and believed in her. And that, she realized, was more than enough.